The rainy day encounter. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Moonbeam Cafe, creating rivulets that blurred the busy street beyond. Inside the cozy establishment, the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans mixed with the scent of cinnamon pastries, creating a warm sanctuary from the dreary October afternoon. Jade Martinez wiped down the corner table for the third time, her movements automatic after 2 years of working the evening shift. At 26, she had perfected the art of being invisible while serving others, moving between tables with quiet efficiency. The cafe buzzed with its usual crowd of office workers escaping the rain, college students hunched over laptops, and elderly couples sharing quiet conversations over steaming mugs. Jade balanced a tray of empty dishes on her hip, navigating through the maze of tables when the front door chimed. A gust of cold, damp air swept through the entrance as a figure stepped inside, immediately drawing unwanted attention. Theodore. Walsh stood in the doorway like a lost soul seeking shelter. His threadbare overcoat hung heavy with rainwater, and his worn leather shoes left small puddles on the polished floor. Despite being in his early 70s, he carried himself with a dignity that seemed at odds with his shabby appearance. His silver hair was plastered to his forehead, and his kind blue eyes held a weariness that spoke of recent hardships. Jade watched as Theodore approached the counter, his steps hesitant and uncertain. She noticed how other customers glanced up. From their conversations, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Behind the register, Marcus Chen, the afternoon barista, looked up from his phone with obvious irritation. Theodore cleared his throat softly and spoke in a gentle voice that barely carried over the ambient noise. "Excuse me, could I please have a small black coffee?" Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically and punched numbers into the register with exaggerated movements. "That'll be $4.50, he announced loudly, making sure nearby customers could hear. Theodore reached into his coat pocket, then his pants pockets, his movements becoming increasingly frantic. His face flushed with embarrassment as he searched through every compartment of his worn wallet, finding only a few coins and an old photograph. "I'm terribly sorry," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "I seem to have forgotten my money, at home. Perhaps I could just sit for a moment until the rain stops?" Marcus crossed his arms and let out an exasperated sigh that echoed through the suddenly quiet cafe. "Look, old man, this isn't a homeless shelter. We're running a business. Here, not a charity. If you can't pay, you need to leave." Several customers turned to stare, and Jade heard whispered comments floating from nearby tables. "Imagine coming into a place like this without money," muttered a woman in an expensive coat. "Some people have no shame whatsoever." A businessman in a sharp suit chuckled coldly. "Probably spent his pension on booze and now expects handouts from decent people." Theodore's shoulders sagged under the weight of their judgment. He clutched his empty wallet tighter and took a step toward the door. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll wait outside until the storm passes." That was the moment Jade felt something ignite in her chest. She had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes where kindness was rare and judgment was constant. She remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to be made invisible, to have people look through you as if you didn't matter. Without hesitation, she approached the counter and pulled a crumpled $5 bill from her apron pocket. "His coffee is on me," she said firmly, placing the money on the counter with a decisive tap. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "Jade, what are you doing? You don't need to pay for random people who can't manage their own finances." "I'm buying a coffee for someone who needs it," Jade replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Last time I checked, that was perfectly legal." The cafe fell silent except for the soft jazz playing through the speakers and the continued patter of rain against the windows. Every eye in the place was fixed on the scene unfolding at the counter. Theodore looked at Jade with an expression of such profound gratitude that it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Miss, you don't have to do this, Theodore said softly. I don't want to be a burden to anyone. Jade turned to face him fully, ignoring the stares and whispers around them. You're not a burden. Everyone deserves basic human decency, especially on a day like this. She gestured toward an empty table by the window. Please, have a seat. I'll bring your coffee right over. As Theodore made his way to the table, Jade heard more murmured comments from the watching crowd. Some customers seemed touched by the gesture, nodding approvingly, while others appeared skeptical or annoyed. She didn't care about their opinions. Something about Theodore's quiet dignity and the genuine shame in his eyes had reminded her of her own grandmother, who had struggled to make ends meet in her final years. Jade prepared the coffee with extra care, adding a small cookie to the saucer without being asked. When she delivered it to Theodore's table, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. Thank you, he said simply, but the words carried more weight than any elaborate speech could have managed. Everyone needs help sometimes, Jade replied. There's no shame in that. As she walked away, Jade caught fragments of conversation from other tables. Some customers were discussing her actions with approval, while others seemed to think she was naive or foolish. Marcus continued to shake his head disapprovingly, muttering under his breath about bleeding hearts and enabling bad behavior. Jade returned to her duties, clearing tables and taking orders, but she found herself glancing toward Theodore's table throughout the afternoon. He sat quietly, sipping his coffee slowly and staring out at the rain-soaked street. There was something about his posture, the careful way he held his cup, that suggested this simple beverage meant more to him than just warmth on a cold day. When her shift ended 3 hours later, Jade noticed that Theodore had long since finished his coffee but remained at the table watching the world pass by outside the window. As she gathered her coat and purse, she wondered about his story. What circumstances had brought him to this moment? Did he have family, a home to return to? She would never forget the look of profound gratitude in his eyes, or the way such a small act had felt so monumentally important. As she stepped out into the rain, pulling her thin jacket tighter against the cold, Jade had no idea that her simple gesture of kindness would soon change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The city streets reflected the neon lights, like scattered jewels on wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky, as if the universe itself was taking note of what had transpired in the little cafe that afternoon. The revelation 3 days passed before Jade saw Theodore again. The memory of that rainy afternoon had lingered in her mind like a half-remembered dream, surfacing during quiet moments between orders and table cleanings. She found herself glancing toward the window table where he had sat, wondering if he was staying warm somewhere, if he had found kindness elsewhere in the city's often indifferent embrace. Thursday evening brought another storm, this one fiercer than the last. The wind howled against the cafe windows, and the rain fell in sheets that turned the street into a rushing river of reflected light. Jade was wiping down the espresso machine when the door chimed, bringing with it a familiar figure who made her heart skip unexpectedly, but this wasn't the same man who had stood dripping and embarrassed 3 days earlier. Theodore Walsh entered the cafe wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal wool coat, his silver hair neatly combed, and polished leather shoes that caught the warm light. He moved with quiet confidence, no longer the hesitant figure seeking shelter from both weather and judgment. Jade nearly dropped the cloth she was holding. Several customers looked up with interest, recognizing something distinguished about the newcomer, but unable to place exactly what had changed. Marcus, working the evening shift again, straightened behind the counter with the instinctive deference people show toward obvious wealth and status. Theodore's eyes found Jade immediately, and he approached her table with purposeful steps. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle quality she remembered. but now tinged with something else. Authority, perhaps, or simply the confidence that came from no longer hiding who he truly was. "You remember my name?" Jade said, surprised by how her voice caught slightly. "I remember everything about that afternoon," Theodore replied, pulling out the chair across from her. "May I sit?" Jade nodded, acutely aware that other customers were watching with undisguised curiosity. The businessman who had made cruel comments 3 days earlier was staring openly, his expression shifting from recognition to confusion to something approaching embarrassment. Theodore settled into his chair with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command. "I owe you an explanation," he began, folding his hands on the table. "And more importantly, I owe you my gratitude." "You don't owe me anything," Jade said quickly. "It was just coffee." A smile played at the corners of Theodore's mouth. "It was never just coffee, Miss Martinez. May I call you Jade?" She nodded again, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had become suddenly unstable. Something about this man's presence had changed completely, and she found herself reassessing everything about their first encounter. 3 days ago, I came here as part of what I suppose you could call an experiment, Theodore continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "For the past 5 years since my wife passed away, I've been traveling to different cities, different neighborhoods, presenting myself as someone in need, not for money or material help, but to see if genuine kindness still existed in the world." Jade felt her mouth go dry. "You were testing people?" "Not testing," Theodore said quickly, sensing her discomfort. "Searching. There's a difference, though I understand it might not feel that way to you." He paused, studying her face. "My name is Theodore Walsh. I'm the founder and CEO of Walsh Industries. Perhaps you've heard of us." The name hit Jade like a physical blow. Walsh Industries was one of the largest privately held companies in the country, involved in everything from renewable energy to affordable housing initiatives. She had seen Theodore's face on magazine covers and news programs, though always in expensive suits and polished settings that bore no resemblance to the man who had stood shivering in her cafe. "You're a billionaire," she whispered, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "I'm a man who lost his way after losing the person who mattered most to him," Theodore corrected gently. "My wife, Eleanor, used to say that wealth was meaningless if it didn't connect you to humanity. After she died, I found myself surrounded by people who only saw my money, never me. I began to wonder if authentic human connection was even possible anymore." Jade stared at him, processing this revelation. Around them, the cafe continued its evening rhythm, but she felt as if she and Theodore existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. "So you decided to find out by pretending to be poor?" she asked, unable to keep a note of accusation from her voice. "I decided to find out by removing the barrier that money creates," Theodore said. "When you have billions, every interaction is colored by what people want from you. 3 days ago, you saw someone who needed help, and you helped without expecting anything in return. You didn't know who I was or what I might be able to give you. You acted purely from compassion." Jade felt tears prick at her eyes, though she wasn't sure if they came from anger, confusion, or something else entirely. "What if I hadn't helped? What if I had been like everyone else?" "Then I would have left, gotten dry, and continued my search elsewhere," Theodore said simply. "But you did help. You spent money you clearly needed on a stranger because it was the right thing to do. That kind of character is rarer than you might think." Before Jade could respond, Nina Rodriguez, the evening manager, appeared at their table. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who rarely missed anything that happened in her cafe. "Excuse me," Nina said, her tone polite but firm. "I couldn't help but notice you're the gentleman from the other day. Is everything all right here?" Theodore stood immediately, extending his hand with practiced grace. "Theodore Walsh," he said. "I wanted to personally thank you for employing someone with such exceptional character." Nina's eyes widened as recognition dawned. She had clearly heard of Theodore Walsh, even if she hadn't immediately recognized him out of his usual context. "Mr. Walsh," she stammered. "I had no idea. Please, is there anything we can do for you?" "Actually, yes," Theodore said, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a business card and handed it to Nina. "I'd like to arrange for Miss Martinez to have tomorrow off with full pay. I have a proposition to discuss with her if she's willing to listen." Jade found her voice at last. "What kind of proposition?" Theodore turned back to her, his expression serious but warm. "I've spent 5 years looking for someone who embodies the values my wife and I built our foundation upon. Someone who acts from genuine compassion rather than self-interest. I'd like to offer you a position with the Walsh Foundation, heading our new community outreach division." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge Jade wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Around them, the cafe had grown quiet, with other customers straining to hear their conversation. "I don't understand," Jade said slowly. "You're offering me a job because I bought you coffee?" "I'm offering you an opportunity because you saw a human being in need and responded with kindness, even when it cost you something you could barely afford," Theodore corrected. "The coffee was just the catalyst." Jade looked around the cafe at the faces watching her with a mixture of curiosity and envy. She thought about her cramped apartment, her student loans, the constant worry about making rent. But she also thought about the elderly man who had sat alone at that window table and how natural it had felt to help him. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Theodore agreed. "Take all the time you need. But know this, Jade. What you did for me wasn't small or insignificant. In a world that often rewards selfishness, you chose compassion. That's worth more than any amount of money." As he prepared to leave, Theodore placed a card on the table. "My personal number," he explained. "When you're ready to talk, call me, day or night." After he left, Jade sat alone at the table, staring at the elegant business card. Nina approached cautiously, her expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what just happened?" Nina whispered. Jade shook her head slowly. "I think my life just changed completely, and I'm not sure I'm ready for it." That night, she lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything. Her roommate Ruby had listened to the story with growing amazement, punctuating Jade's account with gasps and exclamations. "You have to. Take the job," Ruby insisted. "This is like winning the lottery, except better because you actually earned it." But Jade wasn't sure it felt like winning. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that jumping would change everything, but unable to see where she might land. The rain continued to fall outside her window, and somewhere in the city, Theodore Walsh was probably in a penthouse suite, perhaps wondering if the young waitress would find the courage to step into a larger world. As dawn approached, Jade realized that her answer had been forming all along. She had helped Theodore not because she expected anything in return, but because helping others was simply who she was. Now she had a chance to help people on a much larger scale. The question wasn't whether she deserved this opportunity. The question was whether she was brave enough to embrace it. The life-changing offer 2 weeks had passed since Theodore's revelation, and Jade had spent every quiet moment wrestling with his offer. She had called the number on his business card 3 times, each time hanging up before anyone answered. The elegant card had become worn from handling, creased from being folded and unfolded as she tried to imagine herself in a world so different from everything she had ever known. Ruby had grown increasingly impatient with her hesitation. "You're overthinking this," she declared over their breakfast of instant coffee and day-old bagels. "The man is offering you a chance to change your life and help other people. What's there to think about?" But Jade knew it wasn't that simple. Accepting Theodore's offer meant leaving behind everything familiar, stepping into a role she wasn't sure she was qualified for, and trusting a man whose motives she still didn't fully understand. What if she disappointed him? What if she proved that his faith in her had been misplaced? The decision came to her on a Tuesday morning, not through any grand revelation, but through a moment of heartbreaking clarity. Jade was serving breakfast to Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who came to the cafe every morning and ordered the same thing: black coffee and a small pastry she would make last for 2 hours. Mrs. Chen always sat alone, counting out exact change from a small coin purse with trembling fingers. "How are you today, Mrs. Chen?" Jade asked, setting down the coffee with extra care. The old woman looked up with tired eyes. "My grandson called yesterday," she said softly. "He got into college, but they can't afford to send him. Such a smart boy, but what good is smart when you have no money?" Jade felt her heart constrict. She saw herself in that story, saw countless others who deserved chances they would never receive. She thought about Theodore's foundation, about the resources that could change lives like Mrs. Chen's grandson's, and suddenly her path became clear. That afternoon, during her break, Jade finally made the call that would alter everything. "Walsh, Industries Mr. Walsh's private line," answered a professional female voice. "This is Jade Martinez," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Mr. Walsh asked me to call him." "Miss Martinez, of course. Please hold while I connect." "You!" Theodore's voice came on the line immediately, warm and familiar. "Jade, I was hoping you would call. Have you made a decision?" "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like to accept your offer, but I have conditions." A pause, then a chuckle. "I'm listening." "I want to understand exactly what this job entails. I want to meet your current staff and see the foundation's work firsthand. And I want to start small, prove myself before taking on any major responsibilities." "Those are very reasonable requests," Theodore said. "Are you free this Saturday? I'd like to show you something." Saturday morning found Jade standing outside the most elegant hotel in the city, wearing her only dress suit and feeling completely out of place. Theodore appeared in the lobby precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Jade, I'd like you to meet Rebecca Santos, our current Director of Community Programs," Theodore said. "Rebecca has been with the foundation for 8 years. Rebecca shook Jade's hand firmly. "I've heard wonderful things about you. Theodore tells me you have a natural instinct for recognizing need and responding to it." They climbed into a sleek black car, and as they drove through the city, Rebecca explained the foundation's current projects. "We focus on 3 main areas," she said: educational opportunities for underprivileged youth, support for elderly, individuals living in poverty, and assistance for working families struggling to make ends meet. Their first stop was a community center in one of the city's most neglected neighborhoods. The building was modern and bright, filled with children's laughter and the sounds of learning. Theodore led them through classrooms where kids were engaged in after-school tutoring programs, computer labs, and art workshops. "We provide free tutoring, college prep courses, and scholarship assistance," Rebecca explained. "Last year, we helped 43 students get into college with full financial aid packages." Jade watched a young girl, no more than 8 years old, working intently on a painting. The child's concentration and obvious joy reminded her of herself at that age, when art had been her escape from the uncertainty of foster care. Their second stop was a senior center where elderly individuals could come for meals, medical checkups, and social interaction. Jade met Harold, a 78-year-old former teacher who had been living in his car until the foundation helped him secure housing. She spoke with Maria, whose medication costs had been bankrupting her until the foundation's healthcare program intervened. "The need is enormous," Rebecca said quietly as they walked through the center. "For every person we help, there are 10 more waiting." Their final stop was the most impressive: a newly constructed apartment complex specifically designed for working families. The units were affordable but dignified, with on-site childcare, job training programs, and financial counseling services. "This is what we can accomplish when resources are properly directed," Theodore said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "But we need someone with fresh perspective, someone who understands what it's like to struggle, to coordinate these efforts more effectively." As they returned to the car, Jade felt overwhelmed by the scope of what she had seen. The Foundation's work was extraordinary, but she could also see the gaps, the ways services could be better integrated, the communities that weren't being reached. "What would my role be exactly?" she asked. Theodore and Rebecca exchanged a meaningful look. "We want you to develop a new program," Theodore said. "Something focused on immediate intervention, identifying people in crisis before they become homeless or desperate. We envision mobile outreach teams, rapid response funding, partnerships with businesses like the cafe where we met." "You would have a budget of $5 million to start," Rebecca added. "A small staff of your choosing and complete autonomy in how you structure the program." Jade felt dizzy. $5 million was more money than she could properly comprehend, and they were talking about giving her control over it. "I've never managed anything bigger than a coffee shop shift," she protested. "Leadership isn't about experience," Theodore said gently. "It's about vision, compassion, and the courage to act. You demonstrated all three the day we met." They returned to the hotel for lunch, sitting in a private dining room overlooking the city. As they ate, Theodore shared more about his wife Eleanor and the values that had driven them to establish the foundation. "Eleanor always said that wealth was a responsibility, not a privilege," he explained. "She believed that those who had been blessed with abundance had an obligation to lift others up. That's what we're asking you to do, Jade. Use our resources to be the person you needed when you were struggling." After lunch, Rebecca excused herself, leaving Jade and Theodore alone. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but weighted, with possibility. "I'm scared," Jade admitted finally. "Good," Theodore said with a smile. "That means you understand the magnitude of what we're offering. If you weren't scared, I'd be worried about your judgment. What if I fail? Then you'll learn from the failure and try again." That's what Eleanor would have said. Theodore's expression grew serious. "Jade, I've been searching for 5 years for someone who could carry forward the work Eleanor and I started. I've interviewed hundreds of candidates with impressive credentials and years of experience, but none of them had what you have." "What's that?" "A heart that responds to suffering without calculating the cost, the wisdom to see people as individuals rather than statistics, the courage to act when action is needed, regardless of what others might think." Jade looked out the window at the city sprawling below them, thinking about Mrs. Chen's grandson, about Harold living in his car, about all the people whose stories she didn't yet know but whose lives she might be able to touch. "When would I start?" she asked quietly. Theodore's smile was radiant. "Whenever you're ready. We'll provide training, support, mentorship. You won't be doing this alone." That evening, Jade returned to her apartment feeling as if she were floating. Ruby took one look at her face and started jumping up and down with excitement. "You took the job! You actually took the job!" "I took the job," Jade confirmed, and saying the words out loud made it real in a way that still felt impossible. As she lay in bed that night, Jade thought about the chain of events that had led her to this moment. A rainy day, an embarrassed old man, a $5 bill, and a decision to choose kindness over indifference. She had no way of knowing that those simple elements would reshape her entire life. Tomorrow, she would call Nina and give her notice at the cafe. Next week, she would begin training with Rebecca and Theodore's team. In a month, she would have her own office, her own staff, and the resources to help hundreds of people. But tonight, she was still Jade Martinez, the waitress who had seen someone in need and responded from the heart. That person, she realized, was exactly who Theodore needed her to remain, no matter how much her circumstances might change, The foundation of her new life had been built on a moment of simple human kindness, and she promised herself that she would never forget that truth, no matter how far this journey might take her. Outside her window, the city hummed with life, full. Jade looked out the window at the city sprawling below them, thinking about Mrs. Chen's grandson, about Harold living in his car, about all the people whose stories she didn't yet know, but whose lives she might be able to touch. "When would I start?" she asked quietly. Theodore's smile was radiant. "Whenever you're ready, we'll provide training, support, mentorship. You won't be doing this alone." That evening, Jade returned to her apartment feeling as if she were floating. Ruby took one look at her face and started jumping up and down with excitement. "You took the job. You actually took the job." "I took the job," Jade confirmed, and saying the words out loud made it real in a way that still felt impossible. As she lay in bed that night, Jade thought about the chain of events that had led her to this moment. A rainy day, an embarrassed old man, a $5 bill, and a decision to choose kindness over indifference. She had no way of knowing that those simple elements would reshape her entire life. Tomorrow she would call Nina and give her notice at the cafe. Next week she would begin training with Rebecca and Theodore's team. In a month, she would have her own office, her own staff, and the resources to help hundreds of people. But tonight she was still Jade Martinez, the waitress who had seen someone in need and responded from the heart. That person, she realized, was exactly who Theodore needed her to remain, no matter how much her circumstances might change. The foundation of her new life had been built on a moment of simple human kindness, and she promised herself that she would never forget that truth, no matter how far this journey might take her. Outside her window, the city hummed with life, full of people with stories she might soon have the privilege to touch, and Jade fell asleep smiling, ready for whatever came next.